Okay, good morning, Professor. In
Morning.
fact, I feel odd by even saying good morning. I see that when, newscasters say good morning on a day of just horror, and I don't even know why they say good morning. I guess it's tradition or pleasantries. Not surprising. I've been a little off public policy wise the last 2 weeks. We didn't have a conversation last week, and to be frank, it's because I was just too raw. When I It's partly the reason I joined the army, actually. Not to kill people, is to defend people. And whenever I see an innocent killed, I really can't cope with it. Whether that's a human tragedy in a personal way, domestic violence kind of stuff, or
Mhm.
whether it's weird gang violence that hurts an innocent, or whether it's a more regional violence that hurts innocents. Like when I had my uniform on, I it's a fair game. I'm a member of the United States Army, and I'm ready to go fight. I can actually understand war better than I can understand terrorism, which is the purpose of terrorism, to just make people terrorized. And I wanted to say I was terrorized last Saturday, but I just feel down public policy wise. So I kind of want to start with that, just to say, that's John. Really, John? You couldn't even really talk about it, verbalize what happened in Israel a week ago Friday. It would be five days in. Yeah, I
Mhm.
really didn't want to talk about it. It was too raw. Does that make sense, or is that human
Yeah, no,
nature? Or
that
is
resonates with me also. I often say like the reason I teach college is because I couldn't emotionally deal with, you know, helping people who were not already kind of on the way up. Like even teaching high school and elementary school was often really too painful for me because you just see so many innocent kids being harmed by their parents or by their situations, and I realized like it's probably I could do it, but it's probably not for me. And same with I could never be a social worker. I could never be a therapist. It hurts too much. And the other thing is that what we're constantly trying to balance. I don't know if you've felt this, but I don't. I I want to do the right thing. I want to hear the stories because I need to, but I never want to um, uh, um, you know, I never want to be. It becomes at a certain point almost ghoulish because
mm,
you start getting overwhelmed and almost deadened to the stories, and thus I try to listen and read, and but as soon as I feel myself not honoring the story I'm hearing, I stop and do something else. And the tragedies have been so overwhelming that it's hard to absorb. Yeah, and yet it feels important. I mean, if I felt the same way during the invasion of Ukraine, although
yeah.
uh, you know, I was teaching World War II last week, and I one of the lines that I say is if it weren't the Japanese had the good fortune of committing their atrocities at the same time as Hitler. Um, you know, it, Putin will one day have the good fortune of committing his atrocities at the same time as Hamas, because if if kind of Hamas is the only group that makes Putin seem better by comparison, you know,
Mm.
because certainly the atrocities committed by the Russians were pretty bad, um, but they weren't proud of them. uh,
Right.
and
It wasn't intentional, like apparently
Well,
Hamas's
sometimes it's
intentions.
intentional, but they hide them in a way.
Yeah.
Even knowing that they should be ashamed of what they're doing, it puts them on a slightly higher moral plane than than someone who is proud of what they're doing and specifically trying to broadcast their cruelty and multiply their cruelty and terror.
So, Professor, I don't think you're an expert in this, but let's keep on a similar theme for a second. I think the basic, maybe an enlisted guy in the army has a day in terrorism. You're kind of, and maybe even 2 days. Maybe you have another day to have self-protection on how to not look like an American soldier when you're, how to make sure you're not the victim of terrorism. And then as an officer, it seems like we had a couple days in terrorism. And then in political science class, university, my degree, maybe we had a week in it overall throughout all my courses. And in law school, I don't think we had any of that. I don't say I'm a subject matter expert in terrorism by any stretch of the imagination, but I was the head of the Homeland Security Task Force for the National Association of Counties after September 11th. And I took a group of 90, I think it was 80, maybe 75 leaders, fire chiefs and police chiefs and mayors and commissioners to DC for a week on all hazards training. And of course, terrorism applies to that as well. Having said all that, I'm really not an expert at it, but I have some awareness of why certain groups would but resort to terrorism. And so I guess I have a superficial understanding of why somebody would be a terrorist. But it is so affrontive is the wrong word, so disgusting, it just astounds me that a human being can do what they did. And to your point, they were filming it in order to exacerbate their terrorism, to show that we should be scared. And I don't think I was scared. I think, and I'm not even sure it was mad. I guess it's resolved to somehow do everything within our capability as humans to encourage, plead, demand, punish people that are willing to take innocent life, intentionally take in human. I get collateral damage too. We study a lot about that. Can you give me some reflections on what we saw last Saturday and how a country responds to that?
Well, I would say that even though what I have studied as a historian has been American political history and American intellectual history, I think you can kind of see from my third and fourth fields this element of what motivated me to study history in the first place, which is really coming to understand that all of the worst atrocities in human history were committed by people with brains just like mine. And understanding the power of ideas and how you order your values and what that can twist you into. In other words, what gets a lot of people into the study of history is the horrors of World War II, and trying to figure out how to prevent that from taking place. And it leads you to kind of, and at least in my case, study what's the constructive part. What do you want to build on one side? What do you want to encourage? And what do you want to always discourage? What are these elements that lead human beings down this path to ordering their values in such a way that they think that committing atrocities is a positive good? Because that's the only way that a human being could commit those kinds of acts is if they believe that what they are doing is good. And so in a way, I'm not an expert on terrorism, but I've spent my entire life studying this part of what makes humans human in all of its aspects. And so, I was obsessed with this question of totalitarianism and pluralism, and I have been for my entire life, because it's what, on one hand, it's pluralism, I think, leads to the good result, and totalitarianism, which is what I think leads to this bad result. I don't know. And as far as what governments should do, they should create the conditions for human beings to live at peace with one another. But ultimately, every government, there we talked about this on the show in a way. Every government is, or I should say that our national system is a reflection of the culture and the system. We talked about this so many times. Having the system is not enough. You have to have people who believe in it. You have to teach the values, or they go away. And if they're not being taught by families, they have to be taught by schools. And they need to be at least not discouraged by our institutions. I think one of the reasons why we're depressed is we see so much moral ambiguity and outright evil from our elite institutions in response. It was kind of it was slow motion horrifying to study it when we think of Nazis, and it was horrifying in slow motion when we think of communism. But when we see these events unfold in Israel or in Ukraine, it is a reminder of, another long-term theme in this podcast, which is the expression shouldn't be those who learn history are doomed to repeat it. The expression should be those who learn history are doomed to watch in slow motion horror as people make the same mistakes over and over again. There are also times when the proper response, we should take it easy on ourselves. Like sometimes the proper response is to cry. Sometimes the proper response is to get angry. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to act out of those feelings necessarily, but you wouldn't be human if you didn't feel them. So there's nothing wrong with feeling the feelings that you have. The question for the long term is, how do we make things better? But sometimes you just have to be sad. And being sad is the appropriate reaction.
I've gone through all that, and as I said, I guess it's resolved. It sounds a little melodramatic, but yeah, I spent a half an hour in the last 10 days looking up to see what my obligation is as a former officer, and I'm 57, and seeing whether I can be recalled, which, by the way, I feel like I should be recalled. It's up to 60, I think, or 65 maybe. And of course, if things are really tough, we're all soldiers. In really bad times, everybody's a soldier. So I have not a dilemma, but I've been thinking about what the role of American citizen is when we see this halfway around the world. Clearly, and then we'll get to more history here. Clearly, the government of Israel has an obligation, a moral, a legal ability, desire, responsibility to react. You just can't be attacked and brutalized and terrorized without reacting, correct? Is there any question that they don't have a legal and moral obligation to respond to what happened to them?
No.
Okay. It's a little more difficult in this situation, kind of like our September 11th, a war. We declared war on terrorism. Well, gosh, that's so, we didn't declare a war on a country. We declared a war, or even a people. We declared a war on terrorism, and we're still in that war on terrorism. I think. I don't think it's ever been retracted. I guess that's very similar to what.
I don't know about that, because President Trump negotiated with the Taliban and invited them to Camp David to negotiate, and we withdrew from Afghanistan. So I
I
don't.
think that's accurate, but we've never rescinded that war on terrorism. There's all sorts of laws that we implemented that are still in, spying on American citizens, for example. That's
Well,
still
but setting up
illegal.
the Department of Homeland Security, but in terms of like actual presidential policy, I think we still have retained the powers to go after people actively engaged in terror against the United States. But in terms of the targets of
Yeah. Okay. We may be saying similar things.
yeah.
So back to Israel, they're declared war on. It seems like I've heard that pronounced two different ways: Hamas or Hamas. So I'm not sure which one it is. But Israel has declared war, and we're seeing what that's going to happen in coming days. In fact, as a sidelight, I thought it was impractical to order 1 million people away, from where they're living to another part of the country, even if it's fairly close. But on the other hand, they didn't do it right away. They said 24 hours to leave. It's been, I don't know, 10 days. So there's been lots of times for collateral damage to not be so significant. Although it is a difficult thing. I understand how complex all this is.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So far,
Hamas is, it's like ordering people to leave North Korea.
right.
It's the Hamas won't let the Palestinian people leave. And even if Hamas wanted to let the Palestinian people leave, Egypt would not let
Right.
the Palestinian people leave. And
Well, but a ton of
part
them
of that,
have left the area that Israel has demanded they leave, haven't they?
yeah, to the extent that people can move, they're doing their best to move in. But Hamas is a terror organization. The use of civilians is part of their strategy in terms of keeping them. They use civilians as shields, and so to them, any people who are around, it advances their cause to be as intermingled with civilians as possible. So
Well,
they're never going to let significant
let me
numbers.
ask a hardball question that I haven't seen on the news yet, but I'm sure I've just missed the wrong show. I'm sure there's all sorts of subject matter experts, which you're probably not. But from your college professorship role, declaring war on Hamas, is that declaring war on 1,500 people or whoever, how many invaded Israel? Or is it a war on like 25 or 3,000 people, who shot rockets as well? Or is it including their families? Or is it including the political establishment of, and that would be hundreds or thousands more? Or is it 100,000? Or is it 2 million? Or is it however many? What do you, any instinct on what they're actually
I
declaring
mean,
war on?
in a way, it's once you begin removing leadership, then it becomes a question of who is still willing to fight, because and this is and in that regard, it's very similar to many wars. It's no different from Germany in World War II. It's no different from the American Civil War. As Sherman said to the people of Atlanta, all that has to happen is you have to admit that this was begun in error and it's perpetuated in pride. And we will go from being your attackers to your protectors. And so it's impossible to know right now the extent of support that Hamas has, precisely because they are engaging in terror. Once people will also change their minds, and they'll also lie and pretend. There are a lot of people who once they don't. I mean, there are some people who actively dislike Hamas, and as soon as they don't have a gun pointed to their head, will denounce Hamas as soon as they're free to do so. And there are some people who are kind of going along with it and semi-sympathetic, but not particularly enthusiastic about attacking Israel. And and there are a lot of people who support the general cause and the general beliefs. And but once the leadership is gone, and there appears to be no way of winning, will throw down their guns and say like, "Hey, I don't want to die for this." So the reasons for fighting are as individual as the circumstances each individual finds himself in. I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but that's, I think, the
It is.
in history.
And here's the dilemma I have that I'd like you to give a historian's answer to. What we did bombing German cities, England and America, but bombing German cities, and what Germany did by bombing London, English cities, and what we did by bombing Japanese cities, and then of course the 2 nuclear bombs.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty tough stuff. I mean, that's just horrible brutalities of war. And I don't know, you blow up my home and kill my family, you're probably made a lifelong enemy of me. I don't care what the government did, but my family's dead and I live somehow and I'm pissed for the rest of my life. But somehow we're now allies with Germany and Japan again after the brutalities of war. So that gets to your point that, how do you get people to stop doing what they're doing, both in war and in terrorism? And it's complicated. It's really complicated. But there's been a long.
It's complicated, but Sherman had it right. You you have to say, I began this in error, and the reason I kept doing it was because of pride. I mean, so it's a difficult but simple equation. That is the only way. I mean, one of my old professors wrote a book called Divided Memory, and it was about how Germany was remembered different. The World War II and the Holocaust was remembered differently in East Germany and West Germany, and what it takes to reckon with what happened. But step one is admit what you did, and come clean and say, that was a mistake. That was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. And then spend the rest of your life proving. I mean, it's like any large sin. All you can do is not do it again. And whether other people forgive you, it is not up to you. And certainly nobody is ever going to forget when you have done something horrible. But I also want to say that what is often most effective is continuing to offer people a way out. So keep saying, hey, I know it wasn't really you who believed this. Let people construct a better narrative around their own role. So, I mean, we did this after World War II in France. France was full of a bunch of collaborators who sided with Nazis and turned over Jews, but we didn't want that to be the future of France. So I don't know if you want to call it a lie or a constructive new story that we allowed France to tell about itself, that they were all members of the resistance and they all would have, and in order to give them a sort of way out of, or I shouldn't say a way out of, but a path towards a better future. So you have to also offer people a way of becoming better as part of any long-term solution.
Okay, one more current event, and then I'd like you to take 5 minutes to talk about kind of not the founding of Israel. People can read a book on that, but kind of the context is how Americans should think about this. Okay. First, one more context. Clearly, Israel, as I said earlier, has a right and responsibility to go track down these terrorists and eliminate them. Sorry, right? I mean, they're not going to have a trial probably. I guess it's conceivable that some could have a trial. Yeah, it's going to be a military action, and it's going to be brutal, and probably on both sides, unfortunately. Well, it has to be on. It's going to be.
Well, it will be. Horrible. Let me say, it will be tragic because in military actions, there will always be innocent people who are hurt. So that's why all, uses of force by any nation, it unleashes unpredictable forces in individuals and in countries. Something that is unlike anything else in the human experience. But as far as it being brutal, I don't know, because I think
and Professor, from what I meant on that one, thanks for covering the other angle. What I meant on that is being an Israeli soldier going into that.
oh,
is just the thought of, do you shoot, do you not shoot,
right.
Are you doing it out of anger, or are you doing it out of mission, are you doing, I mean, it's just brutal. It is just, nothing's fun about that.
No, I agree with that. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's just, I'm kind of putting on my soldier hat on this about the difficulty of that mission. It just horrible. But they got to do what they got to do. You have to, right? And do most peoples around the world agree with that? Or is there a substantial portion of the Middle East that say, no, my God, I can't even believe Professor or Stephen Tootle and John Brackney are talking in this way. They stop. Now's the time for peace, complete peace. You got to have peace. You can't, I assume there's a lot of people who would disagree with this conversation, correct?
Well, I find that to be a bizarre and dishonest thing to call for right now, because a cessation of hostilities right now would not be peace. It's like saying, after what the Japanese did in Nanking, that we should call for peace right now. But that would leave the Japanese in charge of Nanking, right? That's not peace. Or calling for peace in Ukraine right now. Calling for peace in Ukraine right now is not peace, because the Russians would be in charge of this stretch of Ukraine. Calling for peace right now is absurd when Hamas is still holding and executing hundreds and perhaps thousands of hostages. So the current situation, you can only call for peace when peace exists.
Yeah, you're being clear on that, so that's good enough for now. Take a couple minutes, whether it's 3 or 10, and talk about what American citizens should be thinking about from World War I, maybe pre-World War I to World War II, to the it wasn't called the Declaration of Independence, but it was close, 1948. And talk about Israel and the Middle East from a U.S. perspective.
Well, I guess I could start at the beginning or start at the end. I
think, don't go way to the beginning, because it goes back thousands of years, so don't go back that far.
Yeah, if anything,
well, if you need to, I guess.
Well, let me start with one obvious thing about the end, which is, if you have ever doubted why Israel needs to exist, the one thing that Hamas just proved is this is why Israel needs to exist. And not just because of that there are groups that want to kill all the Jews, that people are willing to support anti-Semitism around the world. And so we saw the terror attack itself, but then the reaction of people around the world who said this is a good thing, where it's time to kill all the Jews. And if anything, it demonstrated this is why Israel needs to exist, because of this force in human history, where of people around the world using the Jewish people as scapegoats. I
assume this isn't the show to understand that, because I don't quite understand that historical and current animosity. And maybe I should understand it more. I don't get it.
Well, it's a lot. I guess now maybe we should go. Let's not go all the way back, but let's go a little bit back.
Okay.
because Jewish people were targeted through pogroms, they were scattered, and they would often go to wherever they were least targeted. And because because within the Christian world, certain jobs were prohibited. I mean, forget just how, I mean, as late as the 1600s in the American colonies, there were people who were put on trial for earning too high of a profit margin. Because Christians were supposed to deal with one another on such a basis where you couldn't actually make profits on one another. It had to be a very small profit margin that you could reinvest in your business. But the making money off of money, or charging interest, or engaging in trade and commerce was discouraged throughout Christendom. But it's also necessary. And so you end up with a situation where you have this group of people who are highly educated because of their religious beliefs, studying the Talmud, studying the Torah. It essentially means that you're giving your kids the same kind of education, or a better education, really, than maybe the best Puritans had, and so it means that you have a highly educated population that goes into things like law, trade, commerce, which means that they are always a minority and always successful, and they don't share the religious beliefs of the majority, and thus everywhere they went, they were resented, because it's a natural human thing to be jealous, and they became a convenient thing for leaders to blame. So in almost every place in almost every place on earth with a Jewish population, there is a history of a leader, when something goes wrong, who knows that the easiest way to solve this political problem for themselves is to blame Jews. And that's what we mean by a kind of structural long-term anti-Semitism. And then in the 19th century, when...
Interesting, by the way, Professor, all that does resonate with me. I guess I did know part of that, or most of it. But in law, we have a thing called asked and answered. I mean, why? And you just answered it. You stand, that's authoritative, and everybody would agree with that.
I think so. I mean, I don't know that any...
Okay, keep going.
That's a kind of standard account. But I would say that the next sort of thing that gets mixed in there is the rise of nation states in the 19th century, at a time with the rise of biological racism and anthropology. So sociology, anthropology, studying evolution, evolutionary biology, these are all new disciplines in the 19th century. And nations are formed. A lot of the nation states that are formed in the late 19th century are formed on the basis of essentially like a bad understanding of history, a bad understanding of economics, a bad understanding of evolutionary biology, a bad understanding of anthropology, and a bad understanding of sociology. And when you're literally forming your national identity in that, at that time, those are the pieces that get put together in order to form national identities. And Jews, being a minority in those nation states, are particularly vulnerable to each of those ideas. And again, we're transitioning from a sort of traditional anti-Semitism to a we must kill all the Jews as how we would order our values. Then when you factor in a calamitous world event like World War I, where people are looking for easy answers, well, you again have people who are willing to blame the easiest people to blame to deflect uh, um, responsibility from themselves. At the same time, because of the oppressions that Jews are experiencing around the world, there becomes this movement to say, hey, maybe Jews need a homeland because there's no place on earth where they're safe. And that is a theoretical notion in a certain way after World War I, and it becomes a fact after World War II, because really I mean, in a way, sort of the United States was the last nail that demonstrated that Israel needs to exist because of our denial of Jewish refugees during World War II. And it meant that even the United States was not a refuge for Jews during World War II. And so,
and Professor,
that brings us up to.
We see when you want to weave in Bart's question or comment.
Yeah. So I think Bart's got something to contribute here.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Professor, one thing I wanted to weave in to the conversation we're having, you haven't said anything wrong, so don't worry about anything. It's all great. There's one aspect of the current crisis that people don't discuss very much. And it's that, in 1948, the UN created Israel. At the same time it created Israel, it also created an Arab country right there. And in reality, Israel got a smaller piece of the land there than the Arab state that the UN created.
Yeah.
What people have to recognize is the Arab population of that area, of what they call Palestine, rejected the UN's creation of an Arab state. What they said is, okay, we reject that. We want the Jews out of this area. We do not want them to have a country. And that's what has led to the modern crisis that we have. The crisis we're in now actually really started in kind of like the 1920s and 1930s, because that's when the leaders of the Arab communities in that part of the world, in what is Palestine, actually started agitating for Arabs to somehow begin to engage in what we would call today terrorist acts against the Jews. For example, in the early 1920s, there was a huge massacre in Hebron there. There used to be a lot of Jews who lived there because there's actually a shrine there to, I think it's Abraham and Sarah and all the, the Jewish, kind of the creators of the Jewish faith. The Arabs pretty much went through there and killed a lot of those people, if not all of them. It was really a very bloody massacre. Well, the Jews, I guess some of them remained there. Most of them left. Some of those activities led to the creation of what has now become the Israeli Defense Force, which is the Israeli army. Because the heads of the Jewish community in that area basically said, okay, we need to defend ourselves somehow. How will we do that? Well, they created basically a defense force for themselves, and it was very primitive at the beginning. But essentially, you had Jewish terrorists and you had Arab terrorists. And they basically spent the 1930s and the early 1940s fighting with each other. And when the UN partitioned Palestine and they created Israel, and they also said, okay, we're creating an Arab state, and the Arabs rejected that, Israel became what we would call today a modern nation state. The Arab population essentially became a terrorist operation. And it has, in one form or another, continued to do that since 1948. You know, and all through the 1950s and the 1960s, the Arab population was engaging in terrorist activities against Israelis and against Jews. And I don't think I'm overstating the case. You know, what happened 2 weeks ago was really just a continuation of that. It was more severe because, for one reason or another, the Israelis dropped their guard and they didn't think that was going to happen. You know, and that event did occur. There were a whole lot of innocent civilians who basically were just, they happened to be in harm's way at that very moment. But this is not a new thing. This has been going on forever, you know, at least 100 years at this point. And I don't, you know, I think that, I don't know what the Israelis are going to do with Hamas. I think they want to eliminate Hamas. I don't know that they can actually do that. Yeah, I think they're going to try. You know, I think they're going to try to make it so Hamas can't operate the way it has for the last 20 years. And that's going to be a big deal. I mean, they're going to, you know.
So Bart, from a layman's, non-historian perspective, you kind of gave the current context of the last 100 years of Israel. Thank you for adding that. Do you have a question or a comment for the professor, or should he get back to kind of the historical?
No, get back to the historical aspects.
The only thing I would add to that, the only thing I would add to Bart's narrative that I think sews things together, are the connections with the sort of biological racism of that gets linked to terrorism, is an international movement that, you know, Nazis and people in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and throughout what was then the British Mandate, people in Turkey, they were all sort of in touch with one another. It was a kind of international anti-Semitic movement. So that frankly, the United States was, I shouldn't say the United States was involved with, but there were people in the United States. I mean, one of the, I wish I could remember who it was, but I remember when I was in Greeley, actually, I was studying something about the founding of one of these neo-Nazi kind of groups, and I found that the leader had studied at UNC in Greeley, and he had become so disgusted with the decadence of the United States from his year in Greeley that he went back to and became a, you know, militant terrorist. And I just remember at the time thinking, you know, looking around Greeley thinking, this is what, you know, motivated him to, and Hitler was in touch with all of these groups, and part of his vision for the for his half of the world would have been coordinating the effort to kill all the Jews everywhere. So he was in touch with those leaders throughout the 1930s. So it was not necessarily sponsored by the Nazi Party, but it was part of an international movement to kill all the Jews everywhere.
Let me do a nuance here, because I want to make sure. I think Jake has to leave in like 5 or so minutes, but let me ask a question before I open it. Let Jake chime in. I'm a little confused about the founding of Israel. Maybe you can clarify it. To me, it looked kind of like the British basically founded it until, yes, Bart, the United Nations declared it. But then it seemed like Israel kind of declared themselves and then were recognized by America and Russia simultaneously the day after the British left. So can you just give me a fact, if you can, on that so I can understand that better?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Israel was created by the United Nations. The UN voted to partition what had been the British Mandate of Palestine, and Israel accepted their territory and declared themselves a country, a state. The Arab population, like I was talking about, said, no,
Okay.
we're rejecting this. We either get all the land or we want none of it. We're just going to push the Jews out.
Okay, so that's all right in one perspective. The UN, British kind of set it up. Then the UN declared it. They declared themselves, and then the US and Russia recognized it, and then so on. Is that, in layman's terms, correct?
I mean,
well,
it was,
that's no. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, I was just going to say it was part of Britain's effort to get rid of its own colonies. So once the UN structure post World War II was that decolonization was something that was supposed to be a positive good. So the question is, what do you do with all of these areas that used to be colonized or under the control of European powers? And so there were people throughout the world, Jewish people throughout the world, who wanted some kind of a homeland, and they were in touch, and they had, people who advocated on their behalf in the British Parliament that if this area is decolonized, that part of it should be a Jewish homeland. But I think you're taking it a step too far if you think that the British created this, because they could have just left, and it was the Jewish, as Bart said, never keep it too far from your own mind that they defended themselves once the British were on the way out. It was who can defend themselves where they are.
Okay.
And then the UN process kind of drew lines around what made the most sense. So, Jordan becomes Jordan, and Israel doesn't attack Jordan. It accepted, as Bart said, the partition as it existed until attacked. And they were attacked in a series of wars.
Okay, cool. And that helps add some context or some lenses for me when I do some more research. So thank you for that, Professor and Bart. Jake, I want to give you one bite at the apple because I think you got to go back and teach a class right now. Do you have a quick second to comment or question before you have to leave?
Yeah, I've got 5 minutes, but this has been really interesting. And I mean, I'm kind of sad that I haven't been as involved in what's going on. It's the end of the quarter this week, so I'm busy, emailing students and parents and being like, no, I'm sorry that your student has an F and they want an A. They've had 9 weeks in which they could have done that. So, and now I'm being told by my administration that I need to dumb down my curriculum. So here we are.
Yeah.
But I just think it's really interesting with the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict that, you have all of these, you have Muslim members of Congress like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar that they're saying that the Jews have started this with their colonialism. But it's like the reason why Palestine keeps getting territory taken away from it is because Hamas is constantly going into Israel. They're doing suicide bombings or they're shooting people. So the IDF will retaliate, and then Israel will take more territory as a buffer zone. And it's like, if you think about it, after the 6-Day War, Palestine had all of its territory taken by Jordan, and then Israel annexed the Sinai Peninsula because they were tired of their neighboring countries going in and attacking them. It kind of goes back to what Toodle's always saying. If you have a democratic government and you believe in peace, you don't need to worry about your neighbors. So like, I don't think Israel is really worried about Jordan going in and attacking it, but it is worried about Palestine because Palestine is ruled by a terrorist group. At the end of the day, like the best thing for the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority, like the country, would be get rid of Hamas and then either give them a democratic form of government or let them have a monarchy, like parliamentary monarchy like Jordan. And then so long as they have a government that actually cares about the Palestinian people, then life will be better for them. And then the IDF won't have to go in every few months and shoot terrorists. If you don't allow your country to be ruled by terrorists, then in theory, your life is going to be better for you. But the problem is you have to get rid of the terrorists.
And that's why I was not necessarily worried about talking about this issue, because the details are complicated, but the big ideas are pretty simple. I mean, I think it was Golda Meir once said, if they lay down their guns, we have peace. If we lay down our guns, we all die. And until that's not true, we can't lay down our guns. I mean, I think one of the, for instance, one of the things I was thinking about last week was just the existence of the Iron Dome. Israel has people shooting rockets into it, and they didn't want to keep going into these territories. Okay, thank you, Jake. If the Palestinians lay down their weapons, there will be peace. If the Israelis lay down their weapons, there will be a massacre. I think that's a pretty fair formulation. But in the case of, I was thinking about like the existence of the Iron Dome is actually an amazing illustration of this point, which is instead of going in and doing what almost every other country would do, which is invading a place that's shooting rockets at you, they actually developed the technology to just defend against the rocket attacks. And they spend a lot of money and a lot of, so that they don't have to, so that they can just protect their own citizens without attacking Palestinians. And in many ways, the existence of the Iron Dome is also what necessitated, as far as the Hamas perspective is, that's what necessitated the terror attacks, because they could no longer simply fire rockets into Israel. They had to find a way of inflicting terror upon Israel. So, it turns out that these attacks were planned for about 2 years, I think was the estimate. And largely because of the effectiveness of something that is purely defensive. I mean, the Iron Dome doesn't fire any rockets at anyone else. All it does is protect Israel from rocket attacks.
But now, as you point out, a new chapter is going to be written.
Yes.
This was a major event, and what's going to happen in coming days and weeks is going to be new books of the history of this region are going to be new. It's a whole new epic.
Well, and I think Israel is, and we moved 2 carrier groups into the region, not one. Mm-hmm. One is a show of force. 2 is we're using it, and apparently the United States has already shot down a couple of Iranian drones in the region. And so the question becomes, and this is all speculation, so I don't know if we want to go down these roads, but we know that the Chinese and the Russians are meeting. We know that Iran is supplying Russia with drones for their war in Ukraine. We also know that Iran is the backer of Hamas, and what they're probably interested in the long term, and the reason why they would like to ramp up attacks is because of the peace agreements that Israel was about to sign with more Arab countries and Arab neighbors, and thus Iran,
specifically Saudi Arabia, correct?
Saudi Arabia, but they're expanding, trade agreements around the world, and it becomes much harder to make an argument that this is somehow that Israel can't get along with Muslim countries when 90% of the Muslim countries, or 90%, I shouldn't say Muslim countries, 90% of Muslim people live in countries that have normal relationships with Israel. there, I don't think Indonesia has a problem with Israel, and if Iran is going to make a move to be the regional hegemon, which is what they always want to be.
Sorry, what's that word mean?
Oh, just the people in charge of the whole place.
Okay, thank you.
Iran, and it's a sort of interesting dynamic because usually Arab peoples resent Persian influence. Iran is Persian, not Arab. But in this particular case, they're willing, the Persians are willing to use the discontent of a Arabic or Semitic people for their own purposes. So as all this is just a long way of saying we don't know how all of these factors are going to unfold. We don't know where any of these lines are with other countries. What's Russia willing to do? What's China willing to do? What's Iran willing to do? And during times like these, I think all you can cling to really are a handful of core traditional American values and say, all we can really try to do is do the right thing based on the information we have at hand and hope for the best.
Yeah, we're not going to entirely end it with that because I at least want to make sure that our occasional guest and friend, Susan, who signed in with us today, if she has any questions or comments before we declare victory. We're almost at a full hour now. Susan, you missed the first couple minutes of our conversation, but welcome. Glad you're here. You don't have to ask any questions or comments, but you're welcome to if you'd like.
Obviously, for me personally, this is a very emotional issue, being an American Jew. And I have a hard time getting past a declarative of from the river to the sea, we will exterminate the Jews of Israel. And then they usually elaborate that they want to exterminate all the Jews in the world. So for me, I can have compassion for innocents being caught in the crossfire, but I'm 100% pro-Israel.
Yeah, and thank you for your interest in this conversation today. Any questions or comments for the professor, or would you just you wanted to make that statement?
I pretty much wanted to make that statement. I appreciate the conversation and I appreciate everything that the professor said and the accuracy of his information.
Okay. That's nice of you, Susan. Thanks for logging in. Bart, last call, or Professor, would you like to wind up? And because obviously we could have carried this conversation on 2 or 3 or 4 hours rather than 1 hour. But is there, Bart, last call, and then Professor, why don't you wind us up for today?
All right. Well, Professor, just one question for you, and this probably warrants like an entire, session. But can you, what's the best geopolitical option for the United States with what's going on in that part of the world right now? In your view, what tends to maximize the most freedom for Americans here at home? And I'm taking my emotion of like Susan being an American Jew out of it. But can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that the Biden administration has done a pretty good job with really only one minor quibble. And because I was encouraged by the Biden administration action to put 2 carrier groups in the region, and I've also been encouraged by the unequivocal support for Israel. There's really only one thing I would say, which is that, and this might have just been a slip of the tongue. But Biden said, our commitment is forever. And then just sort of there's a part of me as an American that says America should have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, because we do want our support for countries to be based on you know, their actions. And I don't think that we should ever give any country a permanent and perpetual blank check, because it turns our national foreign policy over to another country. So with that being said, in this current crisis, what is best for the United States over the long term is the support for Israel, whether we know it or not. And for the same reasons it would be to support Ukraine. And if anything, they illustrate what is in the best interest of the United States. Anything that encourages long-term peace in the world is good for the United States, because we are founded on the understanding that human beings can live with one another in peace. And that can only happen when with true tolerance. And tolerance does not mean celebration or acceptance. You know, I always say, like, I think maybe on this show even I use this example of, you know, if you like all these people, then what are you tolerating? You know, no, true tolerance means I don't like these people, I don't approve of how they live, but I will live at peace with them. And we must insist on tolerance. There, as Ms. I think your last name is Welch. Is it Welch? Susan, what's your last name? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But as she said,
Body, the B.
Oh, sorry. There are certain things where it is ultimately an ideological conflict. It is ultimately a conflict over values, and it's a conflict that only can end when they renounce the idea that they would like to kill all the Jews. There can be no compromise with that position. You know, you can't have one side saying we would like to have tolerance and the other side saying we want to kill all of you. That's not an acceptable long-term solution. And the people of Israel deserve what every other human being on earth deserves. They deserve a chance to live at peace. They deserve to be able to live lives of their own choosing and express their love of life and in peace. And there really is no compromise when it comes to that. And what is always in the best interest of the United States in the long term is encouraging that. Now, as to what our role is, that is largely going to depend on what other people do. And we don't really have control, and this is another thing, we don't really have control over what other people do. All we can do is be ourselves. And what Iran chooses to do is up to Iran. What China and Russia and Hamas and Hezbollah choose to do, that's up to them. What Egypt chooses to do, that's up to them. And what Saudi Arabia, you know, United Arab Emirates, you know, what they all choose, that's up to them. We cannot control them. All we can do is express our values and always be willing to, you know, live at peace. And as I said, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. And we have nothing to fear from any country that that's willing to live at peace with us. And the idea of collective security, which is that important to always emphasize, is that it is good for the United States and our national defense every time a group of people on Earth is safe, prosperous, and free. So what we want for every group of people on Earth is for them to be safe and prosperous and free. We don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited time. There are limitations to how much we can encourage that in the world. But anything that points the world towards safe, prosperous, and free is good for our national defense.
That's a good way to end. Professor, thank you for your time on this most urgent of questions, because we're going to see stuff that's just not going to be, it's just going to be really unpleasant in coming days, weeks, and months. And to Bart's point, it's been going on for decades. I get it, Bart, but this is a new chapter that I think we all have to pay more attention to as citizens. And I think your overriding principles, safe, prosperous, and free, is a noble precept for us to be pondering as citizens, and how to help others do that when they're inclined to be helped. All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We'll obviously be talking about this again in future conversations. All right, Susan, thank you. Bart, have a great day, you all. Enjoy.